When dismissive avoidants are young, the world often rewards the very behavior that is quietly hurting them. Think about it. Society praises independence. It admires people who appear emotionally unaffected, self-contained, impossible to shake. A dismissive avoidant learns very early how to survive by relying only on themselves. Somewhere in childhood, consciously or unconsciously, they absorb a dangerous lesson. Emotions are unsafe. Vulnerability creates disappointment, and needing people leads to pain. So they adapt. They become emotionally efficient. They learn how to detach before they can be rejected. They learn how to suppress before they can be hurt. And in the beginning, this strategy works. They often appear calm under pressure, rational, strong. They become the person who says, "I don't need anyone." And because they genuinely believe that emotional distance equals safety, they start building an identity around self-sufficiency. But here is the psychological paradox nobody talks about. The same defense mechanism that protects the heart also prevents it from fully living. What looks like strength from the outside is often emotional survival from the inside. As the years pass, something subtle begins to happen. The emotional armor that once felt empowering slowly becomes automatic. They stop knowing how to truly connect, not because they are incapable of love, but because closeness activates fear deep inside the nervous system. Intimacy starts feeling invasive. Dependence feels weak. Emotional conversations feel exhausting. So instead of leaning into relationships, they create distance. They withdraw. They intellectualize. They convince themselves they are simply independent, when in reality they are emotionally defended. And this becomes especially dangerous with age because time changes the meaning of isolation. When you are young, isolation can feel like freedom. You are distracted by ambition, goals, stimulation, movement, and endless possibilities. But aging strips away distraction. Life becomes quieter. The nights become longer. The emotional consequences of avoidance become harder to outrun. The relationships they neglected begin to disappear. Friends move on. Romantic partners stop trying. Family connections weaken. And suddenly, the independence they worship starts transforming into loneliness they cannot explain. This is the hidden tragedy of the dismissive avoidant. They do not always feel lonely in the traditional sense. Many of them become emotionally numb long before they become consciously lonely. They normalize disconnection so deeply that they stop recognizing what genuine intimacy even feels like. They may sit in a room full of people and still experience emotional isolation because the wall is no longer between them and others. The wall has become part of their identity. Psychologically, this is what unresolved attachment wounds do. They create a life organized around protection rather than connection. And CD on, when repeated long enough, becomes a prison. The human nervous system was never designed for permanent emotional self-containment. We are biologically wired for attachment, for trust, for emotional resonance. No amount of intellectual independence can replace the need to feel deeply seen and emotionally safe with another human being. But dismissive avoidants spend years overriding that truth. They convince themselves that needing less makes them stronger, while secretly becoming more disconnected from themselves. And eventually life confronts them with a painful realization. Avoiding vulnerability does not eliminate suffering, it only delays it. Because one day they wake up and discover they mastered the art of not needing people, but never mastered the art of truly loving them. They protected themselves from heartbreak, but also from intimacy, warmth, and emotional belonging. And the cost of that realization grows heavier with age. This is why emotional avoidance is not free. Freedom is the ability to connect without fear, to love without losing yourself, and to be vulnerable without seeing it as weakness. The strongest people are not the ones who feel nothing. The strongest people are the ones willing to feel deeply without running away from themselves. One of the most misunderstood things about dismissive avoidance is that many of them do not look emotionally wounded at all. In fact, they often look highly successful, disciplined, focused, ambitious. They become builders, achievers, problem solvers, and on the surface it seems admirable. While others are overwhelmed by emotional chaos, the dismissive avoidant appears composed and productive. But if you look deeper psychologically, you begin to understand that achievement is not always driven by passion alone. Sometimes it is driven by emotional displacement. For many dismissive avoidants, success becomes a substitute for connection. Instead of seeking emotional intimacy, they seek control. Instead, of investing deeply in relationships, they invest in goals, routines, careers, money, status, or personal mastery. Why? Because achievement feels predictable. People do not. Accomplishments feel safe because they do not demand vulnerability. A career cannot abandon you emotionally. A goal cannot reject you. Success becomes the perfect emotional refuge for someone terrified of dependence. And again, in the early stages of life, this strategy is rewarded. Society celebrates the person who works non-stop, who appears emotionally independent, who prioritizes productivity over feelings. The dismissive avoidant often receives admiration precisely for the behaviors that are quietly disconnecting them from emotional life. They become addicted to motion because motion keeps them from reflection. As long as they are chasing the next milestone, they do not have to confront the emptiness underneath the pursuit. But eventually, every external achievement reaches a psychological limit. There comes a moment, especially with age, where accomplishment stops numbing emotional absence. The promotion loses its emotional impact faster than before. The money creates comfort but not peace. The distractions no longer silence the loneliness. And this is where many dismissive avoidants experience an internal crisis they struggle to explain even to themselves. Because the human being is not fulfilled by achievement alone. You can dominate professionally and still feel emotionally starved. You can build an extraordinary life externally while remaining disconnected internally. And the older a dismissive avoidant becomes, the more impossible it becomes to escape that truth. Time begins exposing what success was actually covering. Psychologically, unresolved attachment wounds often create what philosophers might call a performance-based identity. The person learns to derive value from competence rather than connection. They feel safest when admired, respected, or self-sufficient, but deeply uncomfortable when emotionally exposed. So they become experts at doing while remaining strangers to being. And this creates a painful imbalance, because eventually life slows down enough for silence to enter. The distractions become weaker. The nervous system begins asking questions achievement cannot answer. Questions like, who truly knows me? Who do I trust emotionally? What relationships did I sacrifice while trying to protect myself? What is the value of success if there is nobody close enough to share its meaning? This is why so many dismissive avoidants experience a strange emotional emptiness later in life. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded in the wrong direction. They mastered survival while neglecting connection. They built external stability while remaining emotionally unavailable to themselves. And the tragedy is that many of them genuinely believed they were pursuing freedom. But emotional isolation disguised as independence eventually becomes exhausting. NG. Human beings are not machines designed only for productivity. We are emotional creatures. We need meaning, intimacy, warmth, and psychological safety. Without those things, success becomes consumption without fulfillment. You keep achieving, yet something essential remains missing. The deeper issue is not ambition itself. Ambition is powerful. Purpose matters. Mastery matters. But when achievement becomes a defense against vulnerability, success turns into emotional anesthesia. It temporarily numbs unresolved pain without ever healing it. And age has a way of removing anesthesia. Eventually, the dismissive avoidant begins realizing that the moments they remember most are rarely achievements alone. They remember connection, presence, love, emotional honesty. The conversations they avoided suddenly matter more than the goals they accomplished. Because at the end of human life, people rarely regret feeling too much. More often, they regret feeling too little for too long. And that is, realization changes everything. Because true success is not measured only by what you build in the world. It is measured by your capacity to remain emotionally alive while building it. One of the most misunderstood things about dismissive avoidants is that many of them do not look emotionally wounded at all. In fact, they often look highly successful, disciplined, focused, ambitious. They become builders, achievers, problem solvers, and on the surface it seems admirable. While others are overwhelmed by emotional chaos, the dismissive avoidant appears composed and productive. But if you look deeper psychologically, you begin to understand that achievement is not always driven by passion alone. Sometimes it is driven by emotional displacement. For many dismissive avoidants, success becomes a substitute for connection. Instead of seeking emotional intimacy, they seek control. Instead of investing deeply in relationships, they invest in goals, routines, careers, money, status, or personal mastery. Why? because achievement feels predictable. People do not. Accomplishments feel safe because they do not demand vulnerability. A career cannot abandon you emotionally. A goal cannot reject you. Success becomes the perfect emotional refuge for someone terrified of dependence. And again, in the early stages of life, this strategy is rewarded. Society celebrates the person who works non-stop, who appears emotionally independent, who prioritizes productivity over feelings. The dismissive avoidant often receives admiration precisely for the behaviors that are quietly disconnecting them from emotional life. They become addicted to motion because motion keeps them from reflection. As long as they are chasing the next milestone, they do not have to confront the emptiness underneath the pursuit. But eventually, every external achievement reaches a psychological limit. There comes a moment, especially with age, where accomplishment stops numbing emotional absence. The promotion loses eye, tease emotional impact faster than before. The money creates comfort but not peace. The distractions no longer silence the loneliness. And this is where many dismissive avoidants experience an internal crisis they struggle to explain even to themselves. Because the human being is not fulfilled by achievement alone. You can dominate professionally and still feel emotionally starved. You can build an extraordinary life externally while remaining disconnected internally. And the older a dismissive avoidant becomes, the more impossible it becomes to escape that truth. Time begins exposing what success was actually covering. Psychologically, unresolved attachment wounds often create what philosophers might call a performance-based identity. The person learns to derive value from competence rather than connection. They feel safest when admired, respected, or self-sufficient, but deeply uncomfortable when emotionally exposed. So they become experts at doing while remaining strangers to being. And this creates a painful imbalance, because eventually life slows down enough for silence to enter. The distractions become weaker. The nervous system begins asking questions achievement cannot answer. Questions like, who truly knows me? Who do I trust emotionally? What relationships did I sacrifice while trying to protect myself? What is the value of success if there is nobody close enough to share its meaning? This is why so many dismissive avoidants experience a strange emotional emptiness later in life. Not because they failed, but because they succeeded in the wrong direction. They mastered survival while neglecting connection. They built external stability while remaining emotionally unavailable to themselves. And the tragedy is that many of them genuinely believed they were pursuing freedom. But emotional isolation disguised as independence eventually becomes exhausting. Human beings are not machines designed only for productivity. We are emotional creatures. We need meaning, energy, intimacy, warmth, and psychological safety. Without those things, success becomes consumption without fulfillment. You keep achieving, yet something essential remains missing. The deeper issue is not ambition itself. Ambition is powerful, purpose matters, mastery matters. But when achievement becomes a defense against vulnerability, success turns into emotional anesthesia. It temporarily numbs unresolved pain without ever healing it, and age has a way of removing anesthesia. Eventually, the dismissive avoidant begins realizing that the moments they remember most are rarely achievements alone. They remember connection, presence, love, emotional honesty. The conversations they avoided suddenly matter more than the goals they accomplished. Because at the end of human life, people rarely regret feeling too much. More often, they regret feeling too little for too long. And that realization changes everything. Because true success is not measured only by what you build in the world. It is measured by your capacity to remain emotionally alive while building it. One of the deepest internal conflicts within the dismissive avoidant personality is this. They crave human connection just like everyone else, but they have trained themselves to experience dependence as danger. And this conflict becomes more intense with age, not less. Because aging slowly forces every human being to confront a reality we spend most of our younger years trying to ignore. Nobody moves through life completely alone. When dismissive avoidants are younger, self-reliance feels empowering. They pride themselves on handling problems alone, suppressing emotional needs, and never appearing vulnerable. They become emotionally uncomfortable whenever relationships require too much closeness, reassurance, or dependency. Somewhere in their early development, they learned that relying on others created disappointment, shame, rejection, or emotional suffocation. So the nervous system adapted by creating distance. And over time, this adaptation becomes identity. They begin to associate independence with worth. The ability to need nothing becomes proof of strength. They admire control because control protects them from uncertainty. But psychologically, this creates an impossible standard for human existence. Because no matter how emotionally guarded someone becomes, life eventually places every person in situations where support is necessary. And that is where the internal tension begins to intensify. As dismissive avoidants age, life naturally becomes more complex emotionally and physically. Health concerns emerge, loss becomes more common, parents age, relationships evolve, energy changes. The illusion of total self-sufficiency starts breaking down under the weight of reality. But instead of moving comfortably toward connection, many dismissive avoidants experience profound anxiety around needing others. Even asking for help can feel psychologically threatening. Why? Because depending activates old emotional wounds buried beneath their independence. To someone with a dismissive avoidant attachment style, needing support can unconsciously feel like weakness, exposure, or loss of control. Vulnerability becomes associated with emotional risk. So even when they desperately need closeness, their instinct is often to withdraw further. This is the paradox that quietly exhausts them. The older they become, the more they may desire emotional safety, companionship, and understanding. But the very mechanisms they built for protection now prevent them from receiving those things fully. They may long for connection internally while behaving distant externally. And because dismissive avoidants often struggle to articulate emotional needs, people around them may misinterpret their silence as lack of care. But internally, there is often conflict happening beneath the surface. Part of them wants intimacy. Another part fears being consumed by it. This creates a psychological push and dash-pull dynamic that becomes increasingly painful over time. They may enter relationships hoping for closeness, only to feel trapped once emotional dependence develops. They may care deeply about someone, yet instinctively create distance the moment vulnerability appears. Not because love is absent, but because closeness activates survival responses rooted in early attachment experiences. And eventually, maintaining that emotional resistance becomes exhausting. The nervous system was not designed to remain permanently guarded. Chronic emotional self-protection drains emotional energy over decades. It creates tension, emotional numbness, and isolation disguised as control. Many dismissive avoidants reach a stage in life where they begin realizing they are tired not just physically, but psychologically tired from carrying everything alone. This is where aging becomes emotionally revealing, because age strips away fantasies of invulnerability. It reminds people that strength is not the absence of need. Real strength is the ability to remain open despite fear. Real maturity is not emotional independence at all costs. It is interdependence, the ability to maintain your individuality while still allowing yourself to trust, receive, and connect. And this realization can feel terrifying for dismissive avoidants because it requires them to unlearn a survival strategy that once protected them. But healing begins the moment they understand something transformative. Dependence is not the opposite of strength. Unconscious fear is. Human beings are meant to support one another emotionally, not from weakness, but from shared humanity. The strongest relationships are not built on control or emotional detachment. They are built on the courage to let another person matter to you without constantly fearing what that vulnerability might cost. And ultimately, the people who grow the most in life are not the ones who never needed anyone. They are the ones brave enough to stop treating connection like a threat. Dismissive avoidants often believe they are emotionally strong because they have learned how to disconnect from pain so efficiently. They know how to stay composed during conflict. They know how to suppress emotional reactions. They know how to detach from situations that overwhelm them. And for a long time, this emotional control can look impressive, even to the people around them. They appear calm while others fall apart, rational while others become emotional, unaffected while others struggle with heartbreak, grief, or vulnerability. But what many people misunderstand is that emotional suppression is not the same thing as emotional mastery. Suppressing emotion simply means the feeling has been pushed out of conscious awareness. It does not mean the emotion disappeared. The human nervous system keeps record of everything unresolved. Pain that is not processed does not vanish, it waits. It settles deeper into the body, deeper into behavior patterns, deeper into unconscious reactions. And this is why dismissive avoidants often experience emotional exhaustion later in life without fully understanding where it comes from. because the mind can deny emotion temporarily, but the body cannot carry emotional avoidance forever. Many dismissive avoidants spend decades operating in survival mode. They intellectualize instead of feeling. They stay busy instead of reflecting. They withdraw instead of communicating. And slowly, over time, this creates emotional numbness, not peace, numbness. There is a major psychological difference between the two. Peace comes from processing emotion. Numbness comes from disconnecting from it. And eventually, numbness begins affecting every part of life. Relationships start feeling emotionally flat. Joy becomes harder to access. Vulnerability feels exhausting instead of meaningful. Even positive emotions become muted because the nervous system cannot selectively suppress pain without also reducing emotional depth itself. The same wall-blocking grief also blocks intimacy, excitement, emotional warmth, and genuine connection. This is one of the hidden costs of emotional avoidance. The person protects themselves from suffering, but unintentionally distances themselves from aliveness. As dismissive avoidants age, this emotional suppression often becomes harder to maintain. Life naturally accumulates unresolved experiences, losses, disappointments, betrayals, missed opportunities, emotional disconnection, grief. In younger years, distractions can temporarily overpower these emotions. But aging slows life down enough for buried feelings to rise back to the surface. And when they surface, they often emerge as exhaustion rather than obvious sadness. Some dismissive avoidants begin feeling emotionally drained all the time. Others experience unexplained irritability, chronic emptiness, anxiety, or deep internal fatigue. They may not even realize that what they are experiencing is decades of unprocessed emotional weight finally demanding attention. Because unresolved emotions do not disappear with time alone. Time only reveals what avoidance delayed. Psychologically, this happens because the nervous system cannot remain permanently armored without consequences. Human beings are designed for emotional movement, not emotional stagnation. Feelings are meant to be experienced, understood, integrated, and released. When emotions are continuously suppressed, the internal system becomes overloaded, and eventually the emotional energy required to maintain detachment becomes unsustainable. This is why many dismissive avoidants become increasingly tired as they not merely from life itself, but from the lifelong effort of staying emotionally defended. And perhaps the most painful part is that many of them cannot easily explain what they feel. Their emotional vocabulary was underdeveloped by years of suppression. They learned how to minimize emotions before they learned how to understand them. So when deeper feelings finally emerge, it can feel disorienting, overwhelming, even frightening. But this moment also carries enormous potential for transformation, because emotional exhaustion often becomes the first crack in the armor. It forces the individual to confront a truth they spent years avoiding. Emotional pain cannot be healed through detachment. Healing requires awareness. It requires vulnerability. It requires the courage to stop running from internal experience. The irony is that true emotional strength was never about suppressing feelings in the first place. Real emotional strength is the capacity to experience difficult emotions without becoming controlled by them. It is the ability to remain open-hearted without collapsing, to face grief without shutting down, to face intimacy without retreating. And eventually life teaches every emotionally avoidant person the same lesson. What you refuse to feel consciously will continue shaping you unconsciously until you finally have the courage to face it. One of the most profound shifts that happens to many dismissive avoidants as they age is that emotional detachment slowly begins turning into reflection. And reflection, if it is honest enough, eventually leads to regret. When they are younger, dismissive avoidants are incredibly skilled at minimizing emotional significance. They convince themselves that relationships ending did not matter that much. They tell themselves they are better off alone. They rationalize emotional distance as maturity, freedom, or practicality. And because they are often disconnected from their deeper emotional needs, they can move through life appearing untouched by losses that would deeply affect other people. But the human mind has a fascinating relationship with time. What we suppress emotionally in one season of life often returns with greater clarity in another. Aging naturally creates more reflection because there are fewer distractions left to hide behind. Life's slow. WS down enough for memory to become louder, and suddenly moments that once felt insignificant begin carrying emotional weight. The relationship they abandoned too quickly. The person who kept trying to love them while they remained emotionally unavailable. The family members they stayed distant from, the conversations they avoided, the vulnerability they never allowed themselves to express. All of it begins resurfacing. And this is where dismissive avoidants often face one of the deepest psychological confrontations of their lives, realizing that emotional avoidance did not protect them from pain nearly as much as they once believed. In fact, many begin recognizing that their greatest losses were not caused by love itself, but by their inability to fully receive it. This realization can be incredibly painful because dismissive avoidants rarely see themselves as emotionally destructive while they are inside the pattern. From their perspective, they were simply protecting their independence. Dense, maintaining space, avoiding drama, or staying focused on practical life. But with age comes perspective, and perspective changes the meaning of old decisions. They start understanding that many people were not asking them for weakness. They were asking for emotional presence. And presence was the very thing they struggled to give. Psychologically, regret becomes powerful because it breaks through emotional numbness. It forces a person to emotionally revisit moments they once avoided feeling in real time. And for dismissive avoidants, this can create a wave of grief that feels unfamiliar because they spent so much of life disconnected from emotional processing. Some begin wondering how different life could have been if they had learned vulnerability earlier. Others recognize that they spent years pushing away the very intimacy they secretly desired. And perhaps the most painful realization of all is understanding that many opportunities for connection do not endlessly return. Ema moves forward. Certain relationships end permanently. Certain people stop waiting. Certain emotional doors close quietly, while the dismissive avoidant is still convincing themselves they do not care. And later, when emotional awareness finally deepens, they may discover they cared far more than they ever allowed themselves to admit. This is the hidden tragedy of avoidance. Feelings delayed are not feelings escaped. But there is also something deeply human and transformative about this stage of awareness. Because regret, when faced honestly, can become a doorway instead of a prison. It can awaken emotional responsibility. It can soften the ego. It can finally force someone to stop intellectualizing life and start feeling it directly. The danger is not regret itself. The danger is remaining emotionally asleep long enough to never learn from it. And this is why aging can become either emotionally bitter or emotionally awakening for dismissive avoidance. Some become hardened by loneliness, convincing themselves even more strongly that closeness is pointless. But others finally begin lowering the walls they spent decades defending. They start recognizing that vulnerability was never the enemy. Fear was. Because beneath almost every dismissive avoidant pattern is not a person incapable of love, but a person deeply afraid of emotional dependence, rejection, and loss. Once they understand that, compassion becomes possible not only for others, but for themselves. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson reflection eventually teaches them. The moments we avoid emotionally often become the moments we remember most painfully later. Because in the end, human beings are not haunted most by what they felt too deeply. They are haunted by what they never allowed themselves to feel at all. At some point in the life of a dismissive avoidant, a defining moment arrives. It may not happen dramatically. It may come quietly through loneliness, exhaustion, heartbreak, aging, or relief. Sidian. But eventually life forces them to confront a question they spent years avoiding. Is emotional isolation truly protecting me? Or is it slowly disconnecting me from life itself? And that question becomes the doorway to healing. Because despite everything we have discussed, the emotional walls, the fear of dependence, the suppression, the regret, the truth is that dismissive avoidants are not permanently broken. Attachment patterns are adaptations, not life sentences. They were learned through experience, and what is learned can also be transformed. But transformation only begins when the person stops running from vulnerability and starts understanding why vulnerability became so frightening in the first place. Most dismissive avoidants did not randomly decide to become emotionally distant. Their nervous system adapted to environments where emotional needs may have been ignored, minimized, criticized, or emotionally unsafe. Somewhere early in life, they learned that closeness carried risk, so they built protection. And over time, that protection became identity. But here is the deeper philosophical truth. Survival strategies that protect you in one stage of life can imprison you in another. A child may need emotional detachment to survive an emotionally neglectful environment. But an adult who never updates that strategy carries childhood defense mechanisms into relationships that require openness, trust, and emotional presence. This is why healing is not about blaming the past endlessly. It is about recognizing when old forms of protection are destroying the very connection you now desire. And this realization changes everything. Because once dismissive avoidants become aware of the pattern consciously, they begin seeing that vulnerability was never weakness at all. Vulnerability is actually the foundation of every meaningful human experience. Love requires vulnerability. Trust requires vulnerability. Intimacy requires vulnerability. Even growth itself requires vulnerability, because growth demands uncertainty, emotional exposure, and the willingness to step beyond psychological defenses. The dismissive avoidant spends years trying to avoid emotional discomfort, but eventually understands that avoiding discomfort also means avoiding transformation. And healing begins precisely at that point. Not when fear disappears, but when the person becomes willing to move through fear instead of obeying it. This process is deeply uncomfortable at first. For someone conditioned to suppress emotions, emotional honesty can feel destabilizing. Expressing needs may feel unnatural. Allowing closeness may trigger anxiety. Receiving love without withdrawing may feel almost foreign to the nervous system. But this discomfort is not proof that connection is dangerous. It is proof that the nervous system is learning a new emotional reality. That is an important distinction. Many dismissive avoidants sabotage healing because they misinterpret vulnerability as EV, density of weakness instead of evidence of growth. But psychologically, healing always feels unfamiliar before it feels safe. The human brain prefers familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom. So the avoidant instinctively wants to retreat back into emotional control because control feels predictable. Yet real peace is never found in control alone. It is found in emotional integration, in no longer needing to hide from yourself, in being able to experience intimacy without feeling consumed by it. In understanding that dependence and loss of identity are not the same thing. Healthy connection does not erase individuality. It strengthens it by creating emotional security rather than emotional isolation. And perhaps the most beautiful transformation happens when dismissive avoidants finally realize they do not have to perform strength anymore. They no longer need to appear unaffected, detached, or endlessly self-sufficient. They begin discovering that true strength is emotional flexibility. Why? The ability to stay open during uncertainty, the courage to communicate honestly, the willingness to let people matter without constantly preparing for disappointment. This is what healing ultimately gives them. Not perfection, but emotional freedom. Freedom from the exhausting need to always protect themselves. Freedom from confusing numbness with peace. Freedom from mistaking isolation for independence. And for the first time in their lives, they begin experiencing connection not as a threat to survive, but as a place where they can finally rest. Because in the end, the people who transform their lives are not the ones who never felt fear. They are the ones who stopped allowing fear to decide how deeply they were willing to live and love.